Hello, everyone. This is Pam Moore, Director of the New Mexico Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program. I'm also part of the New Mexico Wellbeing Committee, and I'm here to introduce Legal Wellbeing in Action, a podcast series offered by the New Mexico Wellbeing Committee. Last year was the first full year of the Wellbeing Committee at work. In identifying ways to bring well-being education and initiatives to the New Mexico legal community, we created a 2021 campaign called What a Healthy Lawyer Looks Like. 2021 is dedicated to educating the New Mexico legal community on a variety of well-being topics that pertain to work and home life. Our goal is that every judge, lawyer, law student, and legal staff person can find some aspect of their mental, emotional, physical, or spiritual health to improve upon. We strive to educate, encourage, and support the New Mexico legal community to show up as their best self in all aspects of life, which means we will be covering a wide variety of topics that relate to the whole human self. Thank you for being here today listening to Legal Wellbeing in Action.
Hello everyone, Tanessa Akins here. I am the Clinical Coordinator for the New Mexico Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program and also the podcast series coordinator. This month's episode is part 2 of Lawyering by Video. Our first episode on the subject aired in February of 2021. I'd like to briefly introduce, or rather reintroduce our speakers, Mr. Rick Cravens and Mr. Sean Fitzpatrick. Gentlemen, I am pleased to have you back with us again. Thank you so much for both being here. Our first episode on this topic was really well received, and I think some of our listeners would love to hear how things have changed, remain the same, and how we think we can go forward as we manage our professional lives in the pandemic, whether that means a hybrid theory of in-person versus partially virtual. To our listeners, as always, we thank you for tuning into Legal Wellbeing in Action, and we hope you enjoy.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you, Tanessa, for that introduction. And thank you, Sean. Today, we're talking about trial by video and actually just lawyering by video in general. My name is Richard Cravens. I started as an insurance defense lawyer. I worked a little bit for the state as a contract attorney in some of the firms I worked with. And I've had my own practice since April Fool's Day of 2014. I do mostly personal injury. I do some complex and commercial litigation, and I have an interesting foreclosure defense practice. Today with me is Sean Fitzpatrick. Howdy, Sean. How you doing?
I'm good, Rick. Thanks for hosting here, and thanks for having me on.
A pleasure. Sean, I understand that you also are a practicing attorney here in New Mexico. What is your practice like?
So my practice is mainly a split 50-50 between personal injury and insurance issues, so insurance bad faith or any issues that plaintiffs have with insurance.
Okay. And do you do any criminal stuff in your practice?
Not anymore. I worked at the DA's office when I started after graduating law school back in 2012, and I did that for about 3 years, and then didn't do it anymore, and don't dabble in the criminal law anymore.
Well, thank you, Sean. And we're here today talking about lawyering by video. And today is kind of volume 2 from a podcast we started back in February, where Sean and I got a chance to talk a little bit about what we anticipated, what we had seen over the last year, and some of the stuff that we were dealing with. At the time, Sean, I know you were getting ready for a jury trial. Did you get a chance to do that jury trial?
Yes.
How did that go?
That is a broad question. How did it go as far as verdict? Well, it's all public information and you can look it up from the case number. But it was, let's put it this way, after the jury came back with the verdict, it wasn't over. We had to do some post-trial motions to try and fix, at least from the plaintiff's perspective, fix what had happened. And for the most part, the case is resolved finally. But to answer your question in regards to COVID practices and how was that trial different, it went as well as could be expected.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that because, as hard as I have tried, I have not been able to get a jury trial in during this whole pandemic. We talked a little bit about with a couple of judges about trying to do either a hybrid or some sort of entirely video jury trial. Never got a chance to do it. Had some interesting conversations with opposing counsel, but it never played out that we got a chance to try it. So I'm kind of interested when you were doing this. And so you did this was it all in person, or did you have some people show up by video? How did that work?
So that was it was hybrid in that all the key players showed up in person. So you had the judge, the jury, the plaintiff's attorneys, and the defendants. All of those individuals showed up in person. But the plaintiffs, we did call an expert witness who testified via Zoom. And so it was hybrid in that fashion, but everyone was in person, masks on, and socially distanced in the courtroom.
So you said everybody had masks on. So I assume that means the jury, are they in the same room with you when you're presenting your case?
Yes. So let me give you a little bit of setting the scene here for the trial. It was in Clayton, New Mexico. They have a one-room courthouse on the second floor. It's a historic building. There's all sorts of different plaques and fixtures about the courthouse. I think a tornado came through there and destroyed part of it back, a long time ago. And so it's a very historic building. And if you look at the different the benches where normally people would watch the trial or other people would sit waiting their case to be called, there's these little metal wire fixtures underneath the seat. And for the longest time, couldn't tell what those were for. And the bailiff, who was a very accommodating, excellent bailiff, explained that to us and gave us a tour of the courthouse. And those wire fixtures were for the cowboys to put their hats under their seat when they entered the courtroom. And until recently, I don't know how recent, but there were spittoons at the end of each row of courtroom chairs. So it was everyone fit in that courtroom, but the jurors were spaced out 6 feet apart in the rows and in there. Only I think about 3 or 4 jurors were actually able to be seated in the jury box. And then the rest were around the courtroom, all wearing masks. And we even had an interpreter in that court case who was kind of at the side whispering into a interpreter device for simultaneous interpretation for one of the defendants who was Spanish speaking.
Nice. So everybody had masks on. Now, you and I talked about this when we did this podcast back in February, and I was kind of trying to picture how hard it is to read a jury when I can see their face. How hard was it when everybody had a mask on?
Well, there was just no way. There was just no way to tell what jurors were thinking or not thinking based on the facial expressions. And in fact, one of the jurors that we had, we sat around and waited for juror comments about things that we did well or questions or thoughts from jurors after the trial concluded. And one of the things that one of the jurors said was, why couldn't we have done this via video so that we could see everybody's mask or see everybody's faces? And your words came back to echo in my mind and haunt me a bit, because it wasn't so much that I wanted to see the jurors' faces, because that's hard to tell anyways, but the jurors wanted to see the witnesses' faces, and I'm assuming the attorneys' faces as well. And they weren't able to do that, and that was a problem.
It's funny, we talked a little bit the last time about how people don't trust lawyers when they don't have masks on. I can't imagine that helped anywhere in that trying to inculcate some sort of honest relationship with the jury.
Yeah, very, very difficult. If you crack a joke, you usually follow it with a smile. But if you can't see the smile, maybe that joke doesn't land very well. Not that we were cracking jokes during the trial, but point being, the communication with the masks on was difficult, not just because you couldn't see facial expressions, but also because the masks that I initially started out wearing were too thick and muffled the voices too much. Because keep in mind, the jurors are in the back of the courtroom and you're in the front of the courtroom and you have a mask on trying to project through the mask. I ultimately had to change mask, put on a different surgical mask, and communication was inhibited, to put it short.
Was it hard to hear people through the masks?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I had no problem hearing because anyone who was doing talking was near me, the judge or the witness or opposing counsel. But for jurors in the back, constantly, well, not constantly, but repeatedly raising hands, saying they can't hear. And that's the good thing, is when they let you know they can't hear. You worry about those who didn't hear anything and just tuned out.
Yeah, that does not sound easy. Let's talk a little bit about the logistical stuff. How many sets of exhibits did you have to have?
Well, that was, I think the last podcast we did, I was printing off thousands of pages because there were a few hundred pages per exhibit notebook, and we had 14 exhibit notebooks. And I was, it was logistically not very fun because then we have a big old box we bring into the courthouse. And of course, that courthouse is on the second floor. And so I'm carrying them up the stairs. I later found they had an elevator, and so I stopped doing that after I found the elevator. But the notebooks themselves, we didn't pass around exhibits as they were published, which sometimes I think is that's, when you're trained all the way through law school and in practice, you give the witness the exhibit, you move to admit the exhibit, and then you publish it to the jury. Well, there wasn't any publishing to the jury immediately because you can't just publish one exhibit because they can't pass it to each other. They're all spread throughout the courtroom. So the exhibits were published to the jury at the close of the case, which, who knows how that affected the outcome.
Interesting. Did any members of the public get a chance to attend either by Zoom or in person?
I don't believe there were any members of the public because the entire courtroom was pretty much taken up by jurors. And I didn't see anyone who wasn't a juror in there. I don't believe it was recorded via Zoom or broadcast via Zoom. I'm not sure about that, but I certainly didn't see any in-person members of the public there.
Did you have anybody participate in different rooms? For example, if you had all your main players in a central room, did you have anybody like Zooming in from other rooms in the courthouse? Or other than your expert, did you have anybody else attending remotely?
No, it was no one else remotely attended. And for the most part, it was a hassle. I mean, we did the best we could, but there was, when you have those bench conferences, right? Well, you can't approach the bench and have a bench conference at the bench. So we would go over into judges' chambers, and judges' chambers isn't that big either. You have two plaintiffs' attorneys, you have a defense attorney, an interpreter, and a pro se defendant, and the judge, all trying to be 6 feet apart in one room, which was not easy. And so that was the only time we would go into a different area of the courtroom to have our bench conferences. And so, of course, we tried to streamline that, and I will give credit to opposing counsel that the trial was actually less interrupted with bench conferences than I would say a normal trial is, because everyone is trying to be as streamlined as possible.
Now, just to follow up a little bit on that thought, did you get a chance to take care of a lot of housekeeping business prior to trial at any pretrial conferences and stuff, such as pre-admit exhibits and stuff like that?
Yeah, we ended up stipulating to a lot of exhibits that really did streamline the trial for the most part. So that, in that regard, maybe lawyering by video forces opposing counsel to really weigh whether they want to fight about an admission of an exhibit. And so a lot of exhibits were streamlined and stipulated too.
Nice. So, and let's talk a little bit about the COVID protocols. Do you remember what the protocols were for entering the courthouse with regard to COVID?
Yeah, so at the beginning of when you entered the courtroom, there was a person taking the temperature of everyone involved. They had like one of those little temperature mounted devices. So it wasn't the handheld thing. You just like put your forehead up to it and it scans you, and then you sign your name and you put the temperature that you were obtained, and then you put that pen into the dirty pen pile, and you go up the stairs and you get into the courtroom. And I think they only had one entrance for people to come in, so that way it was a controlled access point, so no one could skip the temperature gun. And of course, masks were required at all times.
Were there a series of questions for you to ask or for you to answer?
Yeah, at the beginning of the trial, and of course, I think even the juror questionnaires had those COVID-related questions. I don't think we had to answer those every time we went in. I can't recall exactly.
Did you feel safe with regard to the COVID only, in terms of how the trial was conducted and all that?
Absolutely. I felt safe because mainly the judge was very, very strict, and rightly so, to make sure everyone had their mask on properly, by the way, which is over your nose and your mouth. And, I still can't believe people don't do that. But anyways, so she was very, very conscious about that and enforcing the 6-foot distancing requirement, and, really vigilant about that. So there wasn't any. I felt more unsafe in the place we were staying during the trial because it was in Clayton, so it was out of town. I felt more unsafe there than in the courthouse.
Oh, interesting. And of course, you had to stay out of town, so that wasn't really a choice.
Right.
So let me ask you a couple of questions about. Well, first of all, did you lose any participants during the course of the trial due to exposure or actually getting COVID?
No, none of that. We did, though, consider part of excusing jurors based on this was right when the vaccine was rolling out. And so some of the jurors were scheduled to get their vaccine during the course of the trial. And so we gave special consideration to those individuals who were due to be vaccinated to get their vaccine and excuse them. But no one disclosed a exposure or anything like that. It was fortunate in that regard.
Nice. We had spoken just before your trial at that last podcast about the difference between in-person as opposed to remote. And I had asked you the question. I said, what do you get out of in-person trials that you cannot get out of a remote trial by Zoom? And I think you said something, there's that undefinable je ne sais quoi, or something that you can actually get in that in-person thing that you can't get in what we're doing right now, because you and I are doing this by Zoom, the podcast.
Yeah.
You and I are talking. Did that happen? Did you get that undefinable thing that you were looking for?
Yes and no. Yes and no. So it was interesting because you could see jurors nod their heads, right? You can see that via video too. But part of what I mentioned to the jurors was that the importance of a jury trial and the importance of gathering. No one's allowed to gather except for our constitutional rights to trial by jury. And that's how important it was in imparting to them what they're here for. And a lot of them nodded their heads. So I think it resonated with them that this is an important thing to do. But after trial, of course, some of the jurors said, why couldn't we have done this via video? You got experts coming in testifying by video. Why couldn't we have just watched this by video? Then we would have at least been able to see people's faces. So the no part of your answer is no, because the in-person intangibles that you might get, at least for a civil case, they couldn't read facial expressions. They couldn't judge credibility as well when someone has a mask on. or when they can't hear them, or when they can't even see them because they're at the back of the courtroom. And of course, counsel is standing normally between the witness and that gallery. That's why you have the jury box, so the jury has an unobstructed view of the witness. And I ended up having to ask questions from the wall, the side of the courtroom to the witness. And so I will tell you this, my views have changed a bit. And if I would do it again, if you have to have masks on, I wouldn't opt for an in-person trial. I think there's more to glean from the video of someone's face, even though the video is remote, than there is from an in-person when someone's face is masked.
So to sum up, if you had that trial to do again, would you try to do that fully remotely so that everybody could see everybody's face?
Yes. The short answer is yes. If everyone could see everyone's face in a way that we could do that, the short answer is yes. The long answer, though, is I still think people should show up because it makes them take their duties more seriously. It puts them in a different physical location. And there's, lots of things that say when you go to a different physical location, your brain just changes its perception, or, its task mode, or whatever you want to call it. So if we could have done it remotely so everyone could have seen everyone's face, yes, would have done it that way rather than in person. But I do think if that means having the jurors stay at home and do it via video that way, I'd have to think about that more.
The Solutions Group, the State Bar of New Mexico's EAP provider, offers confidential and free professional counselors to support employees and their direct family members by offering short-term counseling, assessment, and referrals for any life struggle. This includes drug addiction, relationship conflict, anxiety, depression, and grief and loss. Other services include dependent care, crisis assessment, intervention, and educational presentations, free well-being webinars, and an online stress assessment tool. Call 505-254-3555 or 1-866-254-3555 and then identify with NMJ Lab to schedule an appointment or video visit.
It's funny you say that, Sean, on that subject. Since the last time we talked, I was pretty, I think, clear in advocating for trying purely remote trials. And we talked about a bunch of different reasons. One of those reasons was, of course, because I think you can see people's faces. I think I said I can actually see people's faces better on Zoom now with my giant screens on my desk than I can see a judge, even without a mask, 20 feet away from me in a courtroom. Well, mostly because I'm getting old. But a lot of that is because it's just easier for me to see stuff. I have all my documents and everything at my fingertips. I don't have to lug giant boxes around. And frankly, I don't have to drive anywhere. That is making me more productive than just about anything else this last year. But it's funny that you've kind of moved your position a little bit. I've actually moved a little bit towards the position you were taking back in February. Since you and I talked, it's funny, I've done a lot of discussions with judges. I did a little bit of research, and I think a couple of things that some guys out in Texas actually found. There was some gentlemen, or some people out in Texas that tried a trial back in May of 2020, and it was a jury trial, and they tried it fully remote. And while they found a lot of things that did work well in the actual process, ultimately a couple of the people in that trial said that they didn't think it was successful for two reasons. And these two reasons I thought were very interesting because I think they're both relevant right now, but they're also interesting things. One of them we can actually reach pretty easily. Those two things were the consistency in the tech that the jurors were using. Some of them were using iPhones, laptops, tablets, and stuff like that. So some of the issues were just simple tech issues. Now, those are pretty easy to get past. I think we talked last time here in Albuquerque, APS, for example, gave all the middle schoolers Chromebooks when this whole thing started, so they could make sure that they had kind of control on the tech, the security, and all the rest of this stuff, and some sort of standardization for the kids, no matter their socioeconomic background so that all the kids could actually have some sort of access to remote learning. The other thing, though, is much harder to deal with. And it's part of a larger discussion going on right now, which is the infrastructure. If you can't have a robust electronic grid or an internet infrastructure, you're never going to be able to have people in the community adequately be present at these things because you won't be able to assure consistent connectivity. And I thought that was a very interesting finding, in that no matter how we work on all the rest of this stuff, that infrastructure thing is going to be a conversation in the background. And of course, that's the conversation going on at the national level right now. I also found that some of the logistics in trying to set up the jury trial, just in, where you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, and all that kind of stuff, it's sufficiently complex and not, I don't think, developed by our courts, or, there's not enough examples out there that says, look, here's how you do a remote jury trial. Here's your package. And, the trial lawyers, got their CLEs on this stuff, or we haven't developed that sufficiently to have a process so that it works well enough for each judge, that they would be comfortable enough to have jurors not there in the courtroom, as well as, like you said, we have jurors fall asleep in the courtroom. How are you going to, make sure they're paying attention when they're somewhere else? Yeah. I think all of those are great questions. Don't have an answer. But hopefully really smart guys are thinking about this stuff.
Well, I think you bring up a good point as far as infrastructure. Aren't the courthouses in our communities a part of the infrastructure that is, essential to governance and life in the United States? What I would say is the whatever infrastructure deals or programs or whatever, probably too late to suggest this to anybody, but the courthouses should be part of that. I think what the position that I've come away with after the trial and currently is that I don't think that video trials should replace the jury trial always. I think that jury trials should be augmented by the video and the tech. So if you have, you got to augment the trial with the tech. You could have screens, an iPad for each juror, 14 that are in the courthouse, that the courthouse has. And whether you mail those to the jurors and do it that way, or you have the jurors come into their little, to the courthouse and stay in little pods or whatever that is, each juror should have a screen. This is 2021. We shouldn't be sharing screens because, one, you can't do that during COVID, and you've got to get close to somebody, and you can't, every juror should have a screen that they can look at, and that attorneys can push documents to or exhibits to or whatever it is. Every juror should have one. That should just be standard. And that should be standard whether or not COVID goes away. It is time. And I think it's time. Well, now I'm getting on some sort of soapbox here, but I think it's time. Come on. They already have screens on their phones, but every juror should have a 12-inch screen, same as the size of paper, that they can look at when a trial is going on. That way they're not squinting, that way they're not, whatever. And that would make things a lot easier as far as documents and binders. I had to put binders together for the jurors. How much easier would it have been to have just a PDF document that is bookmarked, that they can look at, that they can mark up, and then the paper's not wasted, the printer ink, which, by the way, is one of the most expensive substances on the planet, more expensive by weight than human blood. Wow. It really doesn't make a lot of sense. This should be standard whether COVID goes away or not. That's what I would say as far as that goes.
Sean, that's a great segue, I think, to what I want to talk about next, which is kind of stepping away so much from the jury trials, because I think the last time and this time we really spent a lot of time concentrating on jury trials, because that is really one of the hardest things. And I know I do personal injury, you do personal injury. It's hard right now to test the numbers, and settlement and all that kind of stuff. If we can't jury trials to actually go test those numbers, it's difficult. It kind of skews the analysis and pretty much everything we do if we can't actually have that jury trial as our fallback position. Or ultimately, it's your client's right to have somebody else decide this, peers and all that kind of stuff. We hold that stuff important enough. But it's funny, we got a chance to do a whole lot of other stuff last year than just jury trials. Last time I said I'd done a few bench trials. And I think there's no reason we can't do bench trials, present evidence, and do all that by video. Done it successfully a bunch of times. It works real well. In terms of tech, it's kind of funny. My clients, I'd say maybe 50% of the time, the tech all my clients are using are their phones. But let's look at the tech in your phones. That's one of the most high-tech things we make today. Everybody has like a $250 to $1,000 computer they carry around with them everywhere with advanced communication abilities, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi. I mean, it's a lot of times better than a computer. And most of my clients and a tremendous amount of people out there do not own computers. Don't really need to. Frankly, I couldn't tell the difference between somebody showing up at a deposition on their phone or if they were showing up on their tablet, except they usually had a harder time making their tablet work. So I don't think the tech on and the nice thing about that is you don't have to issue anybody anything. Almost everybody has a phone. The question is whether or not the tech is good enough on their phone. For example, I had one client and she was old school. So I went down there to help her get ready for a Zoom deposition. We could not make Zoom work on her phone. It was the weirdest thing in the whole world. And she didn't know her passwords. Her kids did all her stuff for her. But when it came, so we set it up by Google Meet. And oddly enough, Google Meet worked perfectly on her phone. We got the deposition done. No harm, no foul. Everybody got what they needed. I've been very impressed at my ability to actually just get stuff done this last year. We talked a little bit about, I think I gave an example of, I had a hearing in Albuquerque one morning and a bench trial in Taos that afternoon. I had time for coffee, a leisurely lunch, could have taken a nap if I wanted to because I didn't have to drive anywhere. Yeah, I'm a personal injury guy. I got a real soapbox about this whole driving thing because I have a lot of clients who are dead, are severely injured because they drove. The most dangerous thing we do right now, well, except for argue with my wife, is drive. Used to, or COVID, it's shopping. So I have a thing, if you can avoid driving, not only do you save time, do I save my clients money? For example, Rule 16 scheduling conference, right? 10 to 15 minutes max. If I have to do it on Zoom, I spend 10 to 15 minutes on that conference. It's awesome. If I have to drive down to the courthouse, park, go through security, wait for the scheduling conference, then go back out to the courthouse, find my car and drive home, all of that without crashing and killing myself, that's about an hour. That's a difference of $75 to my client if it's an hourly client or $250 to my client. Similarly, I think I gave an example last time. If I have to drive 2.5 hours for a Rule 16 scheduling conference, which is not unheard of, and 2.5 hours back, that is a cost to my client of almost $1,500 as opposed to $75. And what is the difference between the Zoom conference and that conference I had to go drive 2.5 hours for? Nothing except the accessibility now from my client, who my clients are real people. Accessibility to the courts and cost is a real thing. So right now I'd like to talk about, I'm all in for doing depositions, hearings, evidentiary hearings. I've had awesome evidentiary hearings by Zoom. Frankly, it's easier for me to handle documents than I am fumbling around in a courtroom.
Okay, but let me ask you something about that, because I had a damages hearing and we had an expert come to testify about medical bills, right? Mm-hmm. And let's say this: you and your expert talk about whatever's going to happen at the hearing, and let's say the expert just spaces it, right? They just space it, and they're not saying what is clearly reflected in the report or whatever. Now, there's a tool when you're in person that you can write anything you want down on a piece of paper and show it to your witness or whatever and say, does that refresh your recollection or whatever? Or, oh yeah, that refreshes my recollection. It can be a word, just a catchword, whatever it is. And there was no way I could refresh his recollection. I couldn't, it was telephonic, so I couldn't, there was no document I could show. There was no report I could put in front of him and say, you said this amount in your report. I just couldn't, other than me testifying and saying, you said this in your report, there's no way to refresh the recollection. And so I will agree with you. It was a lot less expensive to get that expert there because he just had to call in. But it was, what do you do in those scenarios when things break down and only in person? Like, what do you do about that? How do you, I guess I'm not asking the question quite the way I haven't formulated the question yet.
Let me ask you this, because you said something I think that might be key. You said that this was a telephonic conference, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So you didn't have the ability to put anything up on a screen or show anybody anything, right?
Yeah.
Because frankly, I mean, I'm showing you something. I'm going to refresh your recollection.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm showing you?
Yeah.
That refresh your recollection. And now I'm taking it away.
Yeah.
Of course, you're showing everybody, but you're going to show everybody in the trial.
Right. Fair enough.
Well, and here's the thing. It's funny because I thought a lot about this and what's the difference, what's better, what's not. And I err on the side of safety. There's people in my house that have compromised immune systems. So we don't take chances. Everybody's vaccinated, but we still don't take chances. But I really think, because I can see you, I can hear you just fine. I don't have to touch you right now. I don't have to smell you or taste you. So if without those three things, those are the only three things I need to actually be standing next to you to do. And frankly, in most trials, I don't need to smell, taste, or touch you or anybody else, frankly. Yeah. I can do all of this. I can see you better right now than if you were, because you're big on my screen. I got a big old screen right here. And I can see you, I can see your background and all the rest of that stuff. Yeah. So it's kind of like, where's the disadvantage for everything that's not the trial thing, the jury thing?
Well, let me ask you, because you said you're all in on remote depositions. What do you think about, this insistence that some attorneys have of, no, I need to have this deposition in person? What do you think about that?
Why?
Well,
what do you need in person you can't get from a remote deposition?
Oh, there's certain it's my right. It's certain intangibles, blah, blah, blah. I get to do it in person.
So actually, you never just gave me a reason. You just said, I have that right? So
yeah, sure.
And I've argued this a lot of times. Right now in COVID, I win all these arguments because it's like safety. And everybody goes, yes. And I don't let people drag me to in-person anything. I actually haven't had to take it to its logical conclusion, but I know attorneys who have. And right now, you'll win that argument every single time if they want to drag you to a deposition in person. And I say, no, I've got compromised people. Well, frankly, that's fine. You show up in person. I'm going to show up by Zoom. My client's going to show up by Zoom. So you can sit in the room all you want. Don't care. And if you think that there's something that you need to get in person from my client, from that deposition, that you cannot get by Zoom, well, if you can't actually state that clearly, then you're probably not going to get it from a judge. Yeah. Because you have to state something with specificity to actually, well, supposedly, judges are going to do whatever judges do, but supposedly you should be able to state with some sort of specificity, or at least elucidate what your argument is. But if you're just saying, well, no, it's my right, it's like, I guess we could argue about the right thing. Yeah. Which is an interesting conversation, because NYU actually just came out with an article about the rights thing, the constitutional rights, and the difference between criminal jury trials and civil jury trials. It's a very interesting article if you get a chance to read it. But the right thing is a very interesting thing. You balance, what is your right to a deposition? Now, you got a right to a deposition. Do you have a right to an in-person deposition? I don't know. Because frankly, I'd argue the crap out of this. And I argue what is safe right now. Yeah. Plus,
it's interesting you bring that up, because I was looking at the COVID numbers from when we did our first podcast versus now. The COVID numbers today are higher than they were when we did our first podcast. And the COVID deaths today are higher than when we did our first podcast. And it's just weird because people are, well, the state's open, things are open, but the risk is no less. It is in fact probably more because of Delta. And so it's just, it blows my, well, when does the risk, when do you lose that argument of safety? is when do people say, you don't get to make that argument anymore?
Well, and maybe here's actually, because my response to that, and it's a visceral response as well as an intellectual response, is like, you do not get to make that decision for me ever. And if a judge tries to make that decision for me, which they do all the time because they make us show up in person, they make us drive places and stuff like that, then it would be worth having that conversation, just like we're having this conversation now. Judge, what is it that we could get out of that in-person thing that we can't get out of doing it remotely? And is that in the balance worth risking people's lives over? Because frankly, if you can't even say with any kind of, I mean, Sean, and you and I have talked about this. We've thought about it for months. I put you on the spot a little bit because you're the one who originally brought it up, that there is that in-person thing you get. And I'm not arguing that that's not correct, because I do believe that sitting in a room with somebody, at least if you don't have a mask on and you can see them and have an honest communication with them and stuff, there's something that I get stuff done there that I don't seem to get other places. I have conversations that end up with successful outcomes with my opposing counsel in the little breaks at depositions and stuff like this. This last year and a half, of course, that hasn't been worth putting anybody at risk. And now, of course, I try to look at this. Is there something that I'm getting out of that would offset my productivity? Because right now, I can do 4 hearings in a day, a little tiny deposition, a couple of stuff, and get it all done in the same day from right here. Now, which brings me to my next question, because we're doing this from 2 different locales. I see you're doing this from an office. I'm doing this from my office at home. So what prompted you? I mean, that's 2 different just positions right there. I'm not going back to an office until it's entirely safe, and I'm not even sure when that's going to be. I mean, you're not wrong about the numbers today. I was hoping to move back into my office on September 1st, but this stuff is crazy again. So I do not know what the future will bring.
Yeah, I think for me, a couple of different things. I mean, everyone's different, but for me, I have, a 2-year-old at home, and as much as I try to ignore, the cries or the yells or whatever, it's a distraction. It's a happy distraction, but when I got to get work done or I'm in a hearing, I need to have a separate physical location. There's a book about it, about how, taxi drivers learn different locations in their brain because our brains are designed for geospatial learning. But I can't remember the name of the book, but it's a good book on it. It's probably one of Malcolm Gladwell's things. But for me, I got to go to work. I go to the office. Every day I put on a shirt and tie, even though I don't go to court every day, but that's my uniform. And this is my, this is where I go to war, so to speak. And so that's what I do. And that helps me get stuff done. Whereas at home, I don't know that I'd be able to do it. But if you obviously are able to find a balance there.
It's funny because for me, it's almost like coming full circle. When I opened my office, when I opened Cravens Law, I started in my living room. We had converted my living room to an office. We had 3 desks in there. I had a couch to meet clients. I had installed doors, so the rest of the house was off limits and stuff. And so I worked in my living room. The hard part about that, of course, is I'd get up at 6, I'd step to my desk and I'd start working. I'd walk away from my desk at midnight that night because I was still working. And it was hard to make those boundaries. It was funny because you have to really, and this is where I think each lawyer, we have to do this for ourselves, the safety thing, the well-being thing, how we actually do this practice, because the practice is hard. So we have all those CLEs on how to be a healthy lawyer and all that stuff. And some of it, I think it's a considerable amount of this has to do with the environment you practice in, which is very interesting because I'm coming at this from the opposite end of the scale. I haven't put a tie on except for a hearing since March of last year. I do not wear long pants unless it gets cold. I do have a jacket and tie, and I got this thing in my, because I put it on right before a hearing. You see my jacket tie. I got it tied. My beard's trimmed and all that kind of stuff. And as soon as the hearing's over, I'm back in a t-shirt and shorts. I am opting for comfort these days. I get a ton of stuff done. It's funny because I do every last week I had 4 hearings, I think a mediation, 2 depositions, and some client stuff. I did them all by Zoom. And I could not have had that big of a week if I had to drive to all that stuff. There's just no way I could get any of that stuff done.
So it's interesting because I think about that, and I think about, does it feel like you're a lawyer when you do all that stuff and you don't even, like, does it still feel like you're a lawyer, or is it some sort of like I don't even know how to say the word, but just like almost like you're in the matrix of law, like it's not real. You're kind of like practicing law and you're getting stuff done, but it doesn't, part of what I enjoy about being a lawyer is like you feel like being a lawyer when you go to court. You feel the pomp and the gravity of what you're about to say when you're in the courthouse and it's all shushed and nobody's saying anything except for you. Does it feel any different when you're just in your skivvies and with a shirt and tie up top?
Well, but it's a really funny thing, and it's a funny way that you say that, because yes, it completely feels different. But I have a different take on my practice. I represent real people. I'm a goal-oriented guy. If it doesn't get stuff done, I don't want to do it. So frankly, if I can do something in 15 minutes and get to a goal, or I could do something in 2 hours and get to a goal, I'm going to take 15 minutes. I want to get to the most efficient way of getting stuff done. At heart, I think it's a utilitarian argument. It's like, I don't care about so much the imperative or all the rest of that stuff. I care about what gets stuff done. Mm-hmm. And if I'm putting on a shirt and a tie actually gets stuff done in front of a judge, that's why I put on a shirt and a tie. Mm-hmm. If drafting a brief gets stuff done, that's why I'm drafting a brief. And frankly, what I do here at my office at home is no different what I would do at my office at work, except for where it is, how I'm dressed, because it's all in my brain. The lawyering thing is in your brain. Yeah. I get paid, which is the strangest thing. If the people I grew up with knew I'm being paid for what I think, they would laugh their asses. But it really is. We are being paid for a product, and the product is our brain. And what we do and how we help people solve problems. And I think at its heart, I think that is a useful analysis for this whole thing. Who do we serve? We don't serve lawyers. We don't serve judges, even though we are officers of the court. This entire system is designed to help real people, litigants, artificial people, corporations. It's to help us get the job done. Which is kind of where it leads me to this, I think the next section of what we wanted to talk about, and we don't have a whole lot of time, but was how we're going forward with this stuff. Because frankly, this system was not doing all that great before the pandemic. And some of this stuff came about for all kinds of reasons. Now, I do a foreclosure defense. So there's a ton of pro se people in foreclosure. And we saw what happened the last time we had this giant foreclosure problem from, was it 2006 to 2009? I still have cases that are ongoing from the fallout of all that stuff. Here in the next 2 years, we are going to see, but we don't really know what we're going to see. A lot of people in the industry predict we are going to see a tsunami of foreclosure filings. And I haven't seen anything in the courts or anything that would alleviate that. So how are we going to deal with all of that in the coming times with all these, because there's going to be a ton of pro se guys, because foreclosure defendants as a group cannot afford $250 an hour attorneys. Because typically if you can afford a $250 an hour attorney, you're probably not in foreclosure. They are by definition, almost across the board, a class that is having financial difficulties. So you're going to have this inundate the courts. Now, there's all kinds of good ideas out there. There's some guys on the other side of what I do who represent the banks who are really smart and have come up with some pretty good ideas about how we could get past some of this, like specialty judges and some other stuff. But all that aside, how are we going to get all these pro se guys to show up to court if we're going to do this the old fashioned way and run through these things? We went through 6 million homes the last time. It's going to, if it's anything like we think it's going to be, this is going to be worse. How are we going to process all those people through this court system that is not as efficient as it could be? The things that we're talking about could make it more efficient. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that there's a program now called the Online Dispute Resolution Program that any creditor that they have to go through for certain claims. And I like it, but I also don't like it, because I think about, there's some quote out there that says, a modicum of justice is not justice, or something like that, they get some justice because they get their case heard, but is that real when you don't have an attorney advising them, or you don't have any someone fighting for them? Maybe they wouldn't have that anyways because they're pro se. But I think you're probably right in that, there should be a way to get people's cases heard without them having to trek down to the courthouse. And and there's got to be a way to do that. I think that the programs like the Online Dispute Resolution Program, for better or for worse, are probably the way that when we get inundated with those types of cases, it'll go, is my guess.
Yeah, I look at it, frankly, just the little stuff we're talking about, like all those little things that make this process so much more expensive, that basically prices my real person clients out of the entire process. And my concern is not so much that we'll have a sucky process, because that happens. I mean, you see foreclosures. I mean, foreclosure defendants, they clog up the courts. They name judges as litigants. They name the other attorney as a defendant and stuff. It's kind of nutty. But I'm concerned more that not so much about that people just bypass the process altogether and just resort to self-help if this process doesn't work. But I already see that we're running out of time. Sean, thank you very much. I had a great time this last time. Very informative. It was great to hear about how the trial went. Interesting to see how the future is going to go. And thank you all for tuning in to Legal Wellbeing in Action.
Thank you, Brent.
Thank you for listening. This episode was produced by the State Bar of New Mexico's Wellbeing Committee and the New Mexico Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program. All editing and sound mixing was done by Blue Sky eLearn. Intro music is by Gil Flores. The views of the presenters are that of their own and are not endorsed by the State Bar of New Mexico. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, or legal advice. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition.